I know that some in our audience know the finer points of hockey.
The Chris Johnston Show.
We are your friends.
The biggest stories, bringing you inside the game.
What did you hear?
The Chris Johnston Show.
What is going on?
Here's Chris with your host, Julian McKenzie.
CJ, today you're stuck with the understudy of the understudy. Julian's away. Steve Dangle couldn't make it because of other obligations, so the understudy of the understudy has to fill in for you today.
I don't know. I feel like we're going up a level with you here. So I don't know if you saw this, but a friend of mine who's a loyal listener, 100%er of the show, gave Steve the biggest backhand compliment ever. Like he said, when I saw Steve was hosting the last episode, I was worried, but it was surprisingly good. So, so some of our listeners weren't expecting much of Steve hosting. I'm sure
Steve
you're going to do
doesn't
a
usually
bang-up
get
job.
to flex his muscles in like a host position because we have Adam and he's been hosting for decades of his life.
Right.
So Steve he relished the opportunity. I'm glad that people enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if he just thought it was going to be an hour of Leaf rants from Steve, but it turns out he does have other thoughts. He doesn't only yell into a microphone, even though that is certainly part of what he does. And so, yeah, it's fun to do something different. And I'm glad, hopefully Julian's working on the summer bod there down in parts unknown.
Yeah,
but
he's a world traveler just like you. You just got back from the Czech Republic and the World Championships. How was that? Like, how you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. I find coming back this direction from Europe not nearly as bad jet lag wise. So got home last night, slept, and here we are this morning. It was a cool experience. It really was neat for me to go back to that tournament. I've spoken how much I love it over there, how much I find it's almost like a carnival for hockey. It's a dream when you do the kind of job I do, especially in the early part of the tournament. I mean, right now we're down to the or the semifinals rather. So there's only 4 teams left, but when you're there and you just walk around and you're just seeing like GMs, agents, all kinds of players, other media members, like it's really cool to all be in one place. And, Prague was beautiful. It was my first time being there. And I really can't say it enough. I am just blown away by the atmosphere in the arena. It's 2 or 3 games a day until this stage of the tournament. And they were basically sold out every game, like 17,000 people there to watch 2 random countries that have nothing to do with Czechia. Like, it's not just that the home games were great. And I was thinking even in Canada, I'm not sure if we would do that, even in best on best or whatever. Like, forget even like the asterisk you might put on the World Championship. I mean, if we had a Switzerland-Austria game at Scotiabank Arena, and we know people in Toronto love hockey, I don't think we would ever sell that out. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's down to like a price point thing or something. Maybe people would latch onto that, but just to go day after day after day and see that arena full and, what an experience.
Yeah,
I
and
was
Prague's
lucky to
not
get to
like
be there.
the biggest city in the world. So just to see the amount of fans that just go to that area for those games, that's incredible to see. And you were there to do work, obviously, and you talked to a whole bunch of people, and the articles are starting to roll out from your work over there. And the first one that I saw was the John Tavares piece you did. You got to sit down with him, and he's over there with his whole family, not even just like his wife and kids, but the grandparents as well, so they could help out with the kids. And that was a really cool insight you had in that piece in the Athletic. But I think everybody really wants to talk about the blurb in there where it seems like he's definitely not going to waive his no movement clause and leave Toronto, and that an extension on July 1st is a possibility for John Tavares.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't put definite anywhere in this situation when it comes to the Leafs, but I would say there's nothing about his demeanor and the way he's discussing things that makes me believe that he's going to look to go anywhere else. And who can blame him? I mean, let's not forget when John Tavares signed his 7-year deal in Toronto. He had lots of other suitors. He could have been in San Jose or Boston or Tampa or Dallas at the time. And, he put his eggs in this basket. He's, those 3 kids that were with him in Prague, they've all since come into him and his wife's life since they've been here in Toronto and been back closer to family. I mean, he's as established as you could be in this place. And I think if there's one takeaway I have in watching him there is he was Canada's best player to my eyes in the games he's played, or certainly in the conversation his best 2 or 3. And that's a good news for the Leafs. I mean, either way, if him performing at a top level, maybe finishing the season in this manner too. I mean, I don't yet know what's going to happen, but Canada has a semifinal game. They haven't lost at the tournament yet. I mean, they've certainly got a chance to come home with a gold medal. And so for Tavares, maybe to have this kind of finish to the year versus, the bitterness of losing in Game 7 overtime in Boston in the first round, could be a positive for his summer, just, a springboard into what's to come. And obviously, whatever happens, it's a massive year for him. I mean, if he plays out his contract in Toronto, he would still be a free agent in 2025. And my feeling in seeing him go there, let's remember, he doesn't have to go to the World Championship. I mean, lots of prominent Canadian players finished their year, didn't even make the playoffs, and chose not to go over for one reason or another. He goes over within days of that loss to Boston. He does go over with his wife and 3 young kids, all under the age of 5. His parents are there. I mean, that's a family commitment to go play in the event. And obviously, it was a letdown for John the way the season ended. I mean, he knows his birth certificate as well as you and I can look it up. I mean, he's turning 34 in September, and he's only got so many chances left to win a Stanley Cup. And so, I think everything about what he's showing you with his behavior, with the way he's played there, with making the family sacrifice versus say just, going in and camping in Muskoka or something, going somewhere more comfortable, maybe going on a vacation somewhere warm. I think he's committed to extending his career as long as he can play. And I think he wants to do it with the Maple Leafs. And I think he's still 100% committed to trying to win a Stanley Cup in his hometown. He did mention to me as well, Jesse, that Craig Berube and him had a conversation this week on the phone. And, the new head coach of his team, him being the team captain, that he intends to sit down with Craig as soon as he can when he gets back to Toronto. And so all those things, again, line up with, his mindset on being here. And so I don't know what management's going to do. I guess that's the unknown in this, is that John can have his ideas on things, but, management and ownership have a say, and perhaps they could lean on him to try to move him out of town, but it just doesn't feel like that's the direction things are headed right now.
It's cool to see that. I know every player that's in the NHL can play through May and June, but it's good to see him keep up this level of hockey through the end of May, entering June, because we've never seen him do it, so him to go over there, keep the competitive nature up and keep that high level of play up is good to see as a Leafs fan, because you want to be like, okay, if we ever made the third round, how's John Tavares going to hold up? And him just going over there and playing at the level he is, you kind of see it outplay there, that he can actually do it, so that's cool. And not to say a guy like,
and
go ahead.
Do you know what's interesting is that, like, he, it's a bigger ice surface there, and if there's one sort of concern you'd have on his game, especially gets older, is just he was never fleet of foot to begin with. How can he handle the pace? Like, he almost looked fast there, and I get it. It's like, you can look at some of these rosters, and obviously you won't know the names of the players, but he's going up against stars. I mean, Switzerland has Roman Josi and Nico Hischier. The teams Canada's played. I mean, he's got Pasternak playing for the Czechs when they played against them. Like, he is playing against pretty top quality opponents. The games too have been very physical, especially the last few that Canada played. I missed the start of the tournament when they had, some of the easier opponents. They started with Great Britain or less accomplished opponents, but like the games lately that I watched, it's sort of playoff intensity. Like, I don't think anything is quite the Stanley Cup playoffs. I'm not saying it's 1-to-1, apples to apples, but it's in those games where, quite frankly, Connor Bedard has showed very little for Canada. It looks as though maybe physically he might be a little bit overmatched or just isn't used to playing there, but certainly he hasn't found his stride. And you see where someone experienced and so strong on a stick, the way John is. And then again, the way I see him keeping up with the game, those are all encouraging signs. And, that's why I say, like, I don't know how this is going to end. I mean, maybe Canada loses 2 games to finish the tournament. They come home with no medal, and you just look at it and go like, oh, what was the point? But certainly it just feels like this could actually be a really positive thing for John personally. Obviously a pretty special experience for his family, no matter what happens on the ice, just to be in Europe together. I mean, I got the sense that that's been really cool for him. And, he's the captain of the team. I mean, there's a lot being asked of him there. And, it's pretty clear to me as well that it's a big carrot for him that we have that 4 nations face-off tournament next February, and even the Olympics in 2026. So basically, 18 months from now, those are carrots for John Tavares. Like, he loves representing his country, and, that can benefit whatever team he's playing for But the Leafs right now, for sure, is that, he wants to stay at the highest possible level. I think he's very driven to do that because he wants a chance to be part of those events. And so all of that to say, I got the sense he's really rejuvenated, might be the best word. We spoke the other day for 10 or 12 minutes, whatever it was. And I just got a real sense like he's pretty fired up about everything that's going on in the hockey world right now. And so, that's the benefit I'd always say to anyone, hasn't been to a world championship or a player thinking about it. Like, I'm sure it's difficult to take the call 2 days after your season ended and you're feeling how you're feeling after the playoffs, but it is a chance to go and maybe just kind of mentally reset and have a better feeling about your game entering the summer. And so whether it's Tavares, Pierre-Luc Dubois is playing on Canada's top line alongside him. We know what a miserable season it was for him in LA. He's played really well there. It's just a different feeling he can take into the summer. And I think that there are others that are on the team that could say the same as well. So, we'll see what happens with the Leafs and the core players. I really don't think that they've yet focused too much internally on exactly how they're going to navigate this, on what it's going to look like. I think some of the rumors and conjecture out there are premature just in terms of where management's at in terms of what it wants to do. But, it would not surprise me with Tavares entering his final year of his deal, obviously going to take a pay cut, on the next contract, wherever it's signed. It's not going to be an $11 million per year contract. And I think when you're viewing it, that's the other thing with the Worlds. When I'm there, you're just watching John Tavares play, right? And he's Canada's top line center. He's taking every big draw. He's in on all the offense. I know he only has one goal, but if you look at the shots he's generated, he's really had a strong tournament for them. You're not saying, oh, is he an $11 million player or not? You're just saying he's a really useful player. And that's, I love the salary cap in some ways, like in terms of I like the way that it gives us a tool to analyze things differently. Some out there obviously hate it, but it does sort of cloud the view, I think, of what a player can be, because we're measuring them against the value of what they make instead of, what they're bringing to the game. And so that's a long way of saying I think John Tavares is going to be a really valuable player still moving forward, especially once he gets beyond this current contract and he's, signed at a lower number somewhere.
If we get to a couple of days from now and John Tavares is raising the little trophy for the World Championships, I feel like the organizers for the Canadian Olympic team in 2026 have to consider him. Like, I feel like he's auditioning right now for all the staff up there that's watching this team go. And I know a lot of people don't have him when they're doing their projections of the 2026 Team Canada team, but I think he has to be there for consideration, right?
Yeah, he would be on my team as of today. It's just, we almost need, it's hard to know where anything will be in 14 or 16 months. That's not a long time in our lives as adults, but a lot can change in how the sporting landscape looks. But certainly, I think he's made a statement in this tournament. It's funny, I've got an article coming out on The Athletic today, kind of just like five people associated with the team that have seen their stocks rise. He's my number one stock riser. And for the exact reason you're saying, it's not like he has to prove anything to Hockey Canada. They know who he is. He's won 2 World Juniors, a World Cup, an Olympic gold. He's been a part of Hockey Canada's program for a long time. But the question is, can he still deliver at his age? Is it time to turn over? How much of the roster will be turned over? And, I think based on this performance, he's got to be right there. And I can tell you, Jesse, Doug Armstrong, who's Canada's Olympic GM in the Four Nations, the head of that committee, he was watching the games at O2 Arena in Prague. John Cooper was there for a few games. He hasn't officially been named Canada's coach, but he was going to be the Olympic coach in 2022. I think it's fair to say he's a strong candidate to be part of the coaching staffs at these future events. Ryan Getzlaff was there, and Ryan, now in retirement from his playing days, is called the player advisor essentially for Hockey Canada. I think he's one of the main go-betweens between players and the organization in terms of recruiting players. So, there's a lot of eyeballs, not just, Rick Nash is the GM of this team. He's worried about trying to win gold here and now. I'm sure John Tavares is worried about winning gold here and now, but there's a lot of Hockey Canada scouts and eyes on this tournament, I think, for trying to project down the road. And some of that's a younger guy like Dylan Cousins, who's had just an awesome tournament. Probably wouldn't, if we went through everyone's projections, I don't know if anyone had Dylan Cousins on the 2026 Olympic team, but I will say right now, he's definitely in consideration. Like he should be in the pool you're looking at because he's had so much success wearing his national team jersey. He kills penalties. Like, obviously we're talking about him being like a fourth line player, likely a 13th forward type of guy. But he has, he's done so much, and he's got 8 goals in this tournament, a couple shorthanded goals. I mean, really nice plays. He's big, he's younger, he's going to get better. So it's players on both ends of the scales. It's maybe some younger ones that are trying to get their name in that conversation. And, I think John Tavares has certainly kept his name in the conversation.
And
with the way
while you were over in Prague, a trade broke, which is a thing that can happen during the playoffs. So, like, you can trade with teams that aren't in the playoffs. So Ryan McDonagh was traded back to Tampa from Nashville. And before we talk about what can happen with this trade or what the trade means, what's it like when news breaks on the other side of the world and you're over in the Czech Republic?
So the cool thing is that trade broke when I was in what's called the mix zone. It's the area where we do interviews at the international events. We don't go into the dressing room the way we do in the NHL. And I can't remember which game had just ended for Canada, but it was after a Canada game. So I'm seeing that trade break in real time, and I'm able to sort of relay the information to people that might be interested by it. In fact, Brandon Hagel had just walked by. He's a member of the Lightning. Now Hagel didn't cross paths with McDonagh because he's only come to Tampa in the last couple of years. But I remember thinking, like, it would have been hilarious if this had a broken and then I could literally just stop him right there. Or Sweden was over there, and I know Victor Hedman was very, very excited to get Ryan McDonagh back to the Lightning. I mean, he's a super popular member of that team. We all know why. He was traded after they reached their 3rd straight Stanley Cup final, like 3 days after he gets asked to waive his no move by Julien Brisebois. And, it was all just salary cap related. I mean, Tampa's been doing that cap dance for a long time. They've lost a lot of players that they really like Andre Palat or Alex Killorn, even Tyler Johnson, if you go back, Yanni Gourde. Obviously Coleman and Goodrow left as free agents after winning the 2 cups there and, forming that really, difficult third line for teams to play against. I mean, they've had to shed so much talent, but getting McDonagh back, it was highly popular among the Tampa players on both sides of the ocean when that news came down. And it's an interesting trade. I think, Nashville's really a team to watch. You didn't know what to expect with Barry Trotz, right? I mean, he's such a long-time coach. He's basically been now a year and a bit in his role with the Predators as the general manager. And what I've seen from him, I think, is a willingness to be bold. I think he understood that organization had gotten a little stagnant. Obviously, they made decisions with Matt Duchene, Ryan Johansson at the end of last season. Now they're shipping out McDonagh. Like, I think they're really a team to watch as, they're going to have to make a call on their goaltending, right? Askarov had a great year for them in Milwaukee. Looks like he might be ready to take the next step. You never know with goalies. I mean, the young goalies, it can be, you don't want to give too much too soon in case they're not ready. Cause there's not a lot of, you don't typically have 5 great goaltenders in your organization at any one time. It's just, it's the nature of the position is, you need to be pretty sure you're stable in what you have. But, UC Saros is a year out potentially from unrestricted free agency. And so I think it's a signal on both ends that Tampa's trying to reload, trying to bring to some degree the band back together, squeeze out whatever they might have left in terms of, trying to win another Stanley Cup. And then on the flip side of that ledger, I think Nashville really, they open up cap space. Obviously the most apparent, part of this move is, they traded him and took nothing back in terms of cap commitments. And, I just think that we're going to see them be quite active here through this period up to the draft.
And for anybody out there who didn't know, the official trade is a 2nd round pick in 2025 going to Tampa, along with a 7th round pick in 2024, and then in exchange for Ryan McDonagh and his full deal. And 2 players were kind of the fallout from this trade. 2 players were mentioned a lot after the trade happened. One was Mitch Marner, who a reporter asked Barry Trotz directly about, does this mean Mitch Marner is coming to Nashville? And then the other is Steven Stamkos and his contract. Does it look like, hey, they're keeping everybody, they're getting the band back together? Does that mean Stamkos is staying? What do you think about those 2 individuals and those 2 teams? Well,
let's start with Stamkos because, I think this is a fascinating situation, and it's a little more pressing in some ways than Marner's because he's a free agent in, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever date on the calendar we're at. We're getting awfully close to July 1st. And it's my understanding that negotiations have been going on between the Lightning and Stamkos. I think both sides are still actively trying to find a number or a contract that works to extend their relationship. And, what that means and what that tells me is that if Tampa, has taken on now McDonagh's money And if they are still going to sign Stamkos, and obviously he's coming off a deal, so that, they're losing what his old cap number was, because I think it's fair to assume, much like Tavares, as I was saying, that he's going to sign for less than he had been making wherever he signs. They're still going to have to move out some money, basically. I mean, something has to give there, because they had already given extensions to players like Cirelli, to Nick Paul, to Brandon Hagel. He's getting a raise too, and so they've already kind of eaten up what is going to be, with the number that's jumping, the cap's jumping by $5 million, give or take, this next season. But they've already committed those dollars, and so how does that work? It points me to there's going to have to be some other trade if they're going to sign Stamkos. Actually, Victor Hedman over in Czechia had made a pretty strong statement, like there's no Tampa without Stammer. Like it's pretty clear when you're talking about keeping the players happy, what the Lightning players want. And it's not, I'm not suggesting by any stretch that management doesn't want to keep Stamkos, but they have to look at it with a little less emotion, right? And that's, I think, what Julien Brisebois does so well in his job is he hasn't made emotional decisions. He's made what he felt were the best business decisions or cap-related decisions with his team. And that's why they've had to say goodbye to all those beloved players I mentioned before, is just that, they got to a certain age where the contracts didn't make sense for the Lightning. And so I don't know how it's going to shake down with Stamkos, but my sense is they're really trying. And it's no mystery that he, in a perfect world, wants to stay there. Again, in a non-cap universe, I don't even think we would have had this discussion. I think he would have just been signed a long time ago, because there's benefits to the organization in keeping him around. I mean, he played damn well for them in the first round too. I mean, let's let it be said, he had a very strong end of the season push for the Lightning. I can't remember where Stammer's numbers ended up, but he had still put up pretty good numbers, and then was one of their best players, if not their best player, in that first round loss to Florida. So the ability and the desire is still there on his end. And Julien Brisebois is definitely a GM that will do something bold. I mean, the time when he traded Ryan McDonagh seemed unthinkable. As I said, they'd just been to 3 cup finals. He was the guy in the last minute when they needed to close out a game, was always on the ice. He was their stopper defensively. And, they dealt him away before he even had time to heal his injuries from a 3rd straight run to the cup final. So don't sleep on the Lightning either, because to sign Stamkos, they're going to have to move someone else. Julien Brisebois talked about Mikhail Sergachev, moving him to the right side. They're pretty loaded up on the left, especially, Victor Hedman. There's another one. He's eligible to sign an extension as of July 1st. Wouldn't surprise me if we saw one announced on that day or around that time. So you now have McDonagh signed for 2 years as a left shot D. You have Hedman as a left shot D. Sergachev had a really difficult year with the injuries he had. He didn't play very much, but you just wonder, at north of $8 million on his cap hit, that does he fit in that group? Could he be someone they look to move? I mean, I would say everything has to be on the table in Tampa, sort of like Toronto in a sense, but really they're trying to do something no team has done. They've been the most successful team of this generation, but they're trying to win one more cup. I think that there would be some real significance to that, and they got some hard choices to make. As for Marner, the funny thing about that question getting put to Barry Trotz is Mitch Marner is under contract to the Leafs. I mean, there's something called tampering in the NHL, which doesn't allow you to talk openly about other teams' players. And so there was no way for him to answer that anyway. What I'll say broadly is, as I could see a fit, that's one of the teams, if Mitch Marner was ever going to consider moving on from, Nashville is a place that I think could make some sense, just given favorable tax environment, fun city, great place to live, a team that, you could argue is one Mitch Marner away from being a real factor in the league. I mean, they had a better season, I think, than most people anticipated, especially when they skipped the Sphere and went on that winning streak. I know Adam Wild doesn't want to.
He hates that.
He hated that narrative.
It's ridiculous, and that nobody would ever be motivated by not being able to see a U2 concert. So, yeah, don't bring that up around him.
Well, that's why I wanted to note it here. I mean, something happened at that point in time. I'm not saying it wasn't the U2 concert. Maybe it was just the kick in the ass they needed. But either way, it clearly, I mean, I think they went on like an 18-game winning streak after that or something nuts. So we're pretty close to that 18-game point streak maybe. But I digress. Marner, I could see why, it's not crazy for people to try to line up the dots there. It's still too soon to say what's going to happen. I mean, Mitch Marner controls all the cards here. Obviously the Leafs and any team they might deal with have to make a deal. And so those teams control that part of it. But, he's got to not only, I think, want to, be willing to leave Toronto, he's got to sign off on where he's going. I would think the only way that this trade likely would make sense is if he's signing an extension as part of the deal, which means he's got to want to do that. The other part about that, just from a practical standpoint, if he's signing an extension, it has to be on July 1st or after when the trade is executed. So this isn't something that can happen even, between now and the draft at the end of June. It would have to happen after that fact. I remember I was well into vacation when the Matthew Tkachuk deal went down. In fact, I was somewhere in Europe at the time because I woke up, in the morning and it had all broken like overnight. I was like, oh my God, look at this. And so let's, I guess, obviously we're going to talk about Marner probably every show between now and July, but I think one thing to remember is I don't think it makes sense for another team to give up a whole bunch of assets to get Mitch Marner as an expiring contract. And so in order for them to do it as with a contract extension, it's going to have to happen in July. And what that tells me is it's not as pressing as people probably want to keep people want to keep it in the front of everyone's mind. I'm not sure that. I think we're in the very preliminary stages of exploring.
Yeah, we
those
talked
kind of
about that
right
exact thing on the Steve Danko podcast, and we kind of tried to will it into being more pressing than it is, because we wanted to say, like, okay, what if the GMs talk at the draft and then they work out a trade that they can execute on July 1st, and then we get the big trade on July 1st. But the way it's probably going to play out is that it's later into the offseason when the cap situation is a little more figured out for teams, and then somebody with a lot of cap space or who can send a lot of money out signs Mitch Marner to the extension, then trades for him as well, just for some assurances going forward. But that won't be figured out until a little later in the offseason.
Right. And look, I'm sure the conversations will happen even before the draft about just what could this look like. Just history tells us these are tough trades to pull off. I think there's a few unique parts of Marner's contract that actually, if in a world he's willing to leave Toronto, that can make this interesting. Once his bonus is paid, for example, on July 1st, he has a very low actual salary for next season, which if you're the team acquiring him, that could be attractive because you might be giving him a big money extension. But if you average out what you're actually paying over 9 years, potentially with an 8-year extension attached to it, it might make sense that way. The Leafs could also be in a position to retain, even up to 50% of his deal for next year, because for them, it's not really about the money, because they're on the hook for the money as it is. It's more about maybe making the cap hit for him more palatable for someone else. And the Leafs have the ability to do that. I'm not saying 100% that's what's going to happen, but I just think there are some creative ways to make this trade work. If it happens, it's going to be one of the bigger trades that we've seen in a long time, probably since the Tkachuk deal. And there's a lot more baked into it than just sort of player assets moving. I mean, you're talking about a hometown kid in Toronto who, was, the sort of, how do I put it? I mean, he couldn't have been more popular in the first few years as a Leaf. And obviously, I think things have soured a little bit on both sides of the equation since then. It's been it's been tough on everyone that's been part of this Leafs team for 6 or 7 years that haven't won these playoff series, that have experienced those repeated failures and some of the criticism and some of the things that come with it. I do think it stacks on top of each other a little bit. Like, I think it gets a little harder each year. As much as I'm sure the comments that you see into the microphone are like, oh, it's a brand new year. Everything's fresh and new. I don't sense that that's the case. I think it's getting harder with each loss or each, lack of breakthrough by the team. And, so someone like Mitch Marner in particular wears that. He obviously lives year round in this area. And so I think he can't get away from it as much as, there's probably some benefit for Austin Matthews to be back home, be around friends and family in Arizona, but he's a long way from Toronto for, not quite half the year, but say 4 months of the year. And I think that there's a chance to rejuvenate and come back fresh, where it's maybe a little tougher for the local guys. So yeah, I think there's like emotions in this potential trade. And then obviously it's going to be a significant transaction, and it's going to forever change, should it happen, it would forever change the direction of the Leafs organization. I mean, it's a point in time where you draw a line and you're like, okay, what did they get back? How did that help? How did they maybe use the cap space? And then what happens with Mitch Marner? Because I just feel like if they trade Mitch Marner, he's a guy that's going to be having a cup day back in Toronto in the future summer. Like, he's a fantastic player. Like, I think the conversation about him isn't even for me as much like he can't produce here, can't perform in the playoffs. Like, I think it's more about the team's decision making. They've tied up so much money in one specific kind of thing, and it hasn't proven to be a successful formula. And so if you're going to alter that formula, he's the easiest player to trade at this point in time. I think in part because of what's happened, and it doesn't feel like it feels like he's tired a little bit. It feels like he's been weighed down by this. Also, he's on an expiring deal. You're not trading William Nylander at the start of an 8-year extension. I don't think you're thinking about trading a 69-goal center ever. As long as Austin Matthews wants to be in Toronto, I think he'll be in Toronto. I don't think you'll ever find a situation where the Leafs are looking to move him. And then with Tavares, I just think, you're not getting him to waive him no move. So, when you go through the situations, it comes back to Marner. And that's why we're going to talk about it for the next 6 weeks and see if you can will it into existence.
It's not Mitch Marner's performance per se, and like his talent that's getting him traded. He's gonna go somewhere, and we all know he's probably gonna go to a good team, and all of us Leafs fans are gonna be sitting there, whether it's next summer, whether it's a couple summers from now, when he's eventually lifting the cup, because he's gonna just be the complementary piece to a very good team, and he's gonna excel in whatever role he is. It just doesn't work with the cap here in Toronto the way they've built it, unfortunately.
Right, and Phil Kessel's had a cup party in Toronto after leaving the Leafs. Nazem Kadri's had a cup party in Toronto after leaving the Leafs. And Mitch Marner, with respect to those guys, is a better player than those two. So, I mean, there's just no reason to think he can't go somewhere else and have success. And I honestly, when I talk about John Tavares feeling rejuvenated when I talk to him in Czechia, I bet if he goes and plays somewhere else, there'll be a moment in time where, in a reporter capacity, I'll be chatting with him, and he's going to see him a million times later, just because I do think sometimes a fresh start, a different perspective, physically leaving one environment and going to another one can actually really change your frame of mind and your happiness. And I don't want to talk about it like it's done, because I really don't believe it's 100% done. I think it's a very challenging situation for everyone to navigate. But, if Mitch Marner leaves Toronto, I think it could be a great thing for him. And then, man, it shifts a lot of pressure on the Leafs front office to either, at least hit a double in that trade. I'm not sure if you're hitting a home run with a player on an expiring contract and a no movement clause. You want to at least hit a double, and then you obviously have to use the cap space you gain in an effective manner. To
hopefully they don't take their hitting tips from the Toronto baseball team, and they just manage to get a strikeout, or the dribbler to first base, and they're out at first, because that's what the Toronto baseball team.
I am out on the Blue Jays this year, by the way. I don't even watch. I'm so out on that program. I'm frustrated.
That's where you get to enter fan CJ mode. And I feel like apathy is coming over the entire Blue Jays fan base, where every night it's the same thing. You get great pitching, and then the hitting doesn't show up, and it's just very depressing.
Well, thank goodness they brought back the home run jacket. I mean, that's that's going to change the whole
definitely going to
mojo.
make them hit better. You've heard us talk about it before, but Shady Rays are the best sunglasses in the biz, and they're an independent company, and over 300,000 people have given them 5 stars on their sunglasses. And I, as well, own a pair of Shady Rays. They're not on my eyes right now because I'm indoors, but when I'm outside on the golf course, they are my go-to shades because they're polarized, so they don't block my view of the ball, even though I'm not the greatest golfer, and even if I had blinders on, I probably couldn't hit the ball. Even if I had the clearest glasses on, I probably couldn't hit the ball perfectly straight every time. But my Shady Rays are perfect when I'm out in the sun all this summer on the golf course. You get 50% off 2 or more polarized sunglasses with the code Johnston. So you can pick up more than one pair, and if you lose one, it's okay because you have your other pair. Once again, the deal is in the description, shadyrays.com. Use the code Johnston, get 50% off 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. This next segment, it's a super original name, never been used before, but I'm going to call it Coach's Corner. because there's been a lot of coaching activity around the NHL. And my theory about this, let me know if you think it's correct, but there's currently only 4 active head coaches who were hired before the 2022 season. So turnover all across the NHL. And I think it has something to do with the pandemic, right? And things kind of being stagnant throughout the 2020-2021 season when you couldn't see your players all the time and things were a little more restricted. So I feel like GMs and presidents were a little more reluctant to move on from head coaches, and now we're still seeing waves of firings coming out of that. Is that theory is kind of correct? Is there anything to that?
Do you know what's funny? I haven't even considered it through that lens, but my gut reaction to it, or my initial reaction, is like, yeah, that could make some sense. Because it's notable how many changes there've been. And, the other part of it is how coaches are paid. And, like what we've seen in this last round of firings, I'll just like to give you 2 quick examples. Lindy Ruff had received an extension from New Jersey that hadn't even started yet when he was fired. Well, guess what? Buffalo hires Lindy Ruff and assumes that money and gives him, money beyond that. And so there was from a financial standpoint, New Jersey, they didn't lose anything by firing him. I mean, they had to pay him for probably a little bit of time, like the gap between, when he was fired and when that hiring happened. But it's sort of in terms of the amounts of money that NHL teams deal with, it's almost nothing. The Leafs gave Sheldon Keefe an extension, fired him before it kicked in. New Jersey hires him, and they assume all that money. And so I feel like there's not a lot of reasons for a team not to fire a coach, if that makes sense, because when so many are being fired and rehired almost immediately, I mean, there's almost no financial consequences. You're obviously, it's the easiest thing to change. It's probably easier to fire Sheldon Keefe than even trade your fourth line center. You know what I mean? Like just from an organizational standpoint, it's definitely something you can do. You can hold it up. You can have a news conference, and the Leafs said lots of nice things, Leafs management, about Sheldon Keefe on the way out the door, but they can say, look, this is going to be different because there's a new sheriff in town and new voice for the team, someone with new ideas, trying to squeeze more out of the roster. And so I think the pandemic wave is actually pretty good idea of that, because I don't remember. Do you remember how many coaches were fired in that time?
I didn't look it up, but I don't think it was a lot. I think that 2021 season, there was like less than a handful of coaches that were fired throughout that season, because it didn't make sense to fire somebody who you're going to bring in to learn who these guys are.
Right. And also it's like anything you were seeing performance-wise you didn't like at that time, you're probably like, but it is a pandemic, and we're playing in front of no fans, and it's whatever. We're in a playoff game on August 30th. Like everything was weird, right? So it was hard to, maybe expectations are almost like put on freeze for a little while because everyone was just trying to get through it all. I like that, because I noticed too, like I'm only a casual follower of the NBA, but it feels like a lot of NBA coaches are being fired too. And like I saw Cleveland fired the coach here, and the Cavs, like it said he'd won like 99 regular season games in the last 2 years. And it's like, that's not exactly like a lack of success. In Sheldon Keefe's case, he gets fired after 3 100-point seasons in a row with the Leafs. Like, it feels like the bar of expectations is pretty high for these coaches.
How does the Keefe contract work with the Devils? Are the Leafs paying a portion of it and then they cover the rest? How does it exactly work? Because I'm not sure, and I'm sure fans aren't really sure as well.
So Sheldon had 2 more years on his deal beyond the season with the Leafs, the deal that he had with the Leafs. When he gets to the point where he's being hired by another team, in this case, New Jersey, there can be kind of a discussion between the teams about splitting how that's paid, what he's owed. And so there's not like one set way it works. In some cases, it's called an offset. So in some cases, let's say for round numbers, if Sheldon was owed $3 million, in some cases, you might say, well, the Leafs will still pay $1 million and New Jersey will pay $2 million. There's other ways it works too. In this case, I believe they essentially scrapped what was remaining of Sheldon's deal, and New Jersey just gave him a new 4-year contract. And so the reason that's beneficial to Sheldon, of course, is it includes a raise on what he would have been paid by the Leafs. I don't know exactly where his deal came in, but it does sound as though he got more money than what was owed to him. He obviously gets 2 additional years. All of a sudden he's got 4 guaranteed years of pay instead of just 2. And, the Leafs aren't going to object to any of that because they're completely off the hook from paying him as of right now. And so, it can be tricky, but it seems like the precedent we're seeing here is a lot of teams are just basically signing the guy to a new deal and releasing the former team of any financial obligations, which is obviously pretty beneficial. Especially some organizations more than others, are a lot stricter with what they're paying, staff members and those sorts of things would be a problem. I mean, we've even seen times where teams have been paying 2 or 3 people not to coach the team because of, these sorts of firings. And if they don't get rehired, but it just feels like if you're the Leafs and you're making that decision, Sheldon is 42, 43, very young as a head coach. He's had all kinds of success. They're going through their checklist of like the pros and cons of firing him and not. I just don't think the money even factors into it. Not because MLSE has so much of it, which they obviously do, but you just know he's going to get hired somewhere else. I mean, the only question all along was, did Sheldon Keefe want to coach again right away? I mean, he went right to the top of the Devils list, and obviously he got to a point where he was comfortable jumping right back in. So yeah, the way it works is that there's not one set formula, but quite often the new team just ends up paying the deal. And usually that coach is getting a raise as part of that deal too, which is always nice. We all want to get paid more.
I'll skip ahead here in coach's corner because Jim Hiller is going to stay in LA. They clearly feel like it wasn't his fault that they failed in the first round. It was more, I guess, the players and the roster construction. So he gets the interim tag removed from him, and he's going to be the new permanent head coach in LA. And then Vancouver's offseason kicks off with Rick Tocchet winning the Jack Adams, and they have their end of season presser with all the players. And the thing that comes out of that is not like Rick Tocchet celebrating him winning Jack Adams and all of that. It's Philip Hronek goes viral for having a combative answer with a reporter. Do you have any thoughts on that one?
I mean, it's funny. I don't know Philip Hronek at all, like on a personal level. I wasn't aware, but apparently both in Detroit and Vancouver, he basically does not speak to the media. Like hundreds of days go by between interviews for him, which is unusual, especially in a Canadian market. And given the season he had, he was, a player who's up for a new contract, who, has earned a raise. I think the debate is how much of a raise will it end up being. I'm sure our colleague at Agent Provocateur has one view, and the Canucks, Alan Walsh, being his agent, and the Canucks have a different view, and that's what they're going to have to work through this summer. But yeah, it was a combative answer. Maybe it's part of his personality. The reporter, I believe it was Jeff Patterson, he did follow up, on the question about being injured by being like, yeah, but weren't you injured? And, he's basically like, well, what do you want me to say? I told you I wasn't injured. It's always the trickiest time of this year, right? Like you want to go in on the players that aren't performing, but the whole time in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, it's going to get to the day the season ends, and they're going to be like, yeah, he was playing with a broken left wrist and punctured lung or something. And it's like, okay, well, I guess we shouldn't have been so hard on him. So, in that case, I think he's just saying, like, is there anything we can attribute, the decline in your production and your play in the playoffs to that we don't know? And obviously Hronek didn't want to go there. So yeah, I mean, social media has changed all that. Like there would have been a day 10 years ago that just happened and almost nobody would know about it. Right. Cause these things didn't used to be like televised live. There was no place for those snippets to live, but you're right. That ends up being probably the biggest takeaway that, the Canucks fan has from the whatever you call it, locker cleanout day. But Hronek's situation is interesting. The Canucks are going to have a cap challenge here. They've got some other UFAs. It looks like Elias Lindholm more than likely will be gone from Vancouver. And, they're still feeling the effects of the Jim Benning era in terms of their cap sheet. And so I don't know if there'll be enough to find a sweet spot there to keep Hronek. And so maybe that'll be his lasting memory of, for fans of Vancouver. That'll be the last he has seen behind a mic.
I always find it interesting when a reporter decides this is the moment I'm going to push back on the player. And it usually happens only in like high pressure markets, but it's always interesting when you're in the scrum and then the reporter comes with a follow-up and it's something that's pushing the player instead of just kind of asking the question, not getting the response you want, and then moving on. Do you know what the mentality is behind that when you have the follow-up that's a little it leaves everybody kind of on edge?
Well, usually when it happens, in my experience, it's after a game. And this will sound weird, but after a game, the tone of interviews tends to be different. It's almost more emotional on both sides. Honestly, some of it, like a fan wouldn't necessarily think of this, but sometimes like a lot of reporters are filing a story right at the buzzer. So like you're kind of like, that's its own sort of sugar rush, I'll call it, or like obviously like just you're amped up, like you're trying to write in real time. Then you're usually like running downstairs to a dressing room or wherever the availability is. Like there's almost less time to think. Like it's just not as calm of an environment. And then, in the player's case, they're obviously coming out of a very emotional game. Like sometimes those interviews are happening like 8 minutes after the final buzzer. And so I find in those cases, sometimes it's a little bit more amped up because everybody is like in it. Whether they have a deadline or they've just played a physical game, maybe they've had an emotional, something happen negative or even positive. Like just sometimes that's where you get those. You don't usually get it on what I guess that would have been probably a Thursday morning in Vancouver. It's a couple days since the season ended. Everyone's had a minute to breathe, to think, sort of more calmly through whatever just happened in the playoffs, to think about what your angles are going to be, even to think about your questions. That's the other part is when I go to say like a locker cleanout day, there's usually a couple players or maybe it's the GM, the coach, whatever it is, whatever my story is likely to be that day. You've had a chance to think through what you need to learn, how you want to ask it. And so again, it doesn't typically get ramped up because you're less likely to have something come out the wrong way. Whereas after a game, sometimes you're in a scrum, like sometimes you're asked, like your mouth is moving and the words are coming out and you haven't even fully thought through your question. And so just the odds of it coming out the wrong way or maybe being misinterpreted are a little higher. And so sometimes that's where you get some back and forth. So I don't know all the details of this particular one, but I will say that it is more unusual to have it happen in that environment. Cause I would bet that was a pretty calm environment. They're in the Canucks media room. Hronek's at a table at the front. Like, I'm sure the reporter was sitting down. Like, sounds weird. Nobody's heart rate should have been up in that moment. But, when this happens, it's often after a game when your heart rate's up because you've like run from the press box to the dressing room. The player's just been through what he's been through. And sometimes that's where I could think of a few over the years. I don't know if it's worth telling stories, but I remember once, this was way back in the Leafs era where things weren't going well. And it was after a game and Cody Franzen was a Leafs defenseman. And someone asked Cody, are you playing to get your coach fired right now? And I just remember him going, fuck no. And like, again, it's emotional reaction because it's in that moment, it's emotion. Whereas that probably wouldn't happen if Cody was at a podium after that season and everything was quiet and someone asked that, he would probably be like, no, it would just be a more thoughtful answer. It'd be, we really like this coach and we did our best. It would be not as emotional, but like, fuck no. I just remember that. Anyway, I'm sorry if I'm now requiring producer.
No, the fuck's got to stay in there. Like that's, I think that's.
We're gonna get the little explicit logo. Though,
it should always have the explicit logo with you and Julian. The last two things here in Coach's Corner. One is a GM note, but Marc Savard leaves the Flames. He's their assistant coach, was in charge of running the power play, and it's rumored that he's gonna go to Toronto and join Craig Berube's staff because he was working with Berube in 2019. And then Don Waddell for the Hurricanes, their current GM, his contract is expired. And Pierre LeBrun tweeted that he's currently speaking with the Columbus Blue Jackets about their empty positions there within their organization. Do you think both of those gentlemen will move to those teams? Do you have any insight on those?
Savard certainly seems like a strong possibility. I know Craig Berube liked working with him when they were together in St. Louis. He's someone who lives in the GTA. Obviously the opportunity for him potentially to come to the Leaf staff is pretty appealing, and so all around I could see the fit there, and certainly for the Leafs. I mean, there's no way for me they can come back. I mean, sure, you've changed the head coach, but they need to have a different approach to their power play. It doesn't even mean Guy Boucher can't remain part of the staff. I mean, sometimes you see what each coach within the assistant coaches, what they're assigned to cover just shifts. And Guy Boucher is known throughout his time when he was a head coach as an excellent defensive coach. And so perhaps there's still a way that he ends up on the staff, but someone new's there. But I certainly, it seems like there's a lot of smoke around Savard, and it does seem as though he's likely to come. And look, it's a great job because of what you have. But it's also a high pressure job because the power play has really abandoned the Leafs at the most important times in most of their playoff losses. Certainly this year they had the one playoff goal against Boston, and you lose in Game 7 overtime. You were basically one more goal away from moving on in that series potentially. They had plenty of opportunities on the power play and weren't able to get the job done. And so, that one makes a lot of sense. The Carolina situation is so unique. I mean, Tom Dundon as the owner is really, truly does things his own way. If you remember, Don Waddell interviewed for the Minnesota Wild GM job and remained Hurricanes general manager before.
I
that
don't
happened
remember
a few years
that.
ago.
Wow.
Bill Guerin. Yeah. He let him go interview for another team's GM job, and he still came back and was a GM in Carolina. Again, that's just not, I would say that's not typical industry standard. But, it does seem as though the relationship has got to a point where I think Waddell's looking to move on. It would be premature to say definitively he's heading to Columbus, but there's certainly some interest there. And I think, one interesting thing, Don Waddell has a very unique set of skills, I'll call them. He's got a lot of experience in the business side of the sport. You're not just looking at him, titles are kind of shifting in front offices, but you're not just looking at him as like a typical GM shaping a roster. I think that he brings a lot on the business side. Originally in Carolina, he was hired to be the president, I believe, of their business operation, ended up taking on a more prominent role in hockey operations as time went along there. But, he can kind of fit in a couple different ways with teams. And I think in Columbus, part of the appeal that he brings to them is that, he's shown he's a very collaborative worker and that he, does have a pretty strong business acumen. So, that's something to consider there. But, it's an interesting time for the Hurricanes. Sure, they managed to get Rod Brindamore signed if we're still doing Coach's Corner to an extension, but they have a lot of pending UFAs. Most of their blue line, Brady Shea, Brett Pesce among them, Teuvo Teravainen. They have a lot of good players that are potentially going to become UFAs, and you might be seeing a GM walk out the door to another team. I know they have Eric Tulsky there, and I would expect you're going to see him with more of a role. Justin Williams, former player, is very close with Dundon. It seems as though those guys are most likely to take on a more senior or, increased bit of influence in the organization if Waddell does leave. But, it's a big summer in Carolina, and they've had so much success, but obviously they've fallen short of their goal. And so how can they push to a new level? And there's, it does seem as though there's going to be some new voices with more control in that organization.
We can all expect a fairly new and revamped Carolina Hurricanes team, just with the amount of guys they have who are UFAs and the cap space that they do have available and some of the decisions they have to make. And a whole new GM might be making those decisions. So it's interesting to watch. And one thing we haven't touched on the whole show is that there are hockey games happening and the Stanley Cup playoffs are still underway. Yesterday, the Edmonton Oilers beat the Dallas Stars in Game 1 on the road. Double overtime. Connor McDavid comes away with the overtime winner less than a minute into the second overtime. What do you think of the Edmonton Oilers' weirdly great defensive performance the last couple of games at the end of the Vancouver series and now to begin the Stars series?
Well, they look like a team to me that have learned through experience. And, it's interesting that they are now closer to the Stanley Cup than they've ever been in the McDavid Draisaitl era, because they were swept a couple years ago against Colorado when they made to the conference final. Now, obviously, they've got one win down. So, 7 wins is still a long way to go to that Stanley Cup. But I think the belief is certainly growing among that team, and it should. They came through a tough series with Vancouver. They had to, find a way to win Game 6 to extend their season, win Game 7 on the road. Now they go to Dallas and get a win, and I still think this is going to be this is almost a coin flip series for me. Nothing about a double overtime result makes you think otherwise, but the Oilers are playing the right way. They're playing the way that generally it is required this time of year to find ways to win 3-2 games, 2-1 games, those sorts of tight scoring ones. And you have to be encouraged by their defensive metrics, probably more than anything else, because you can count on their power play, clicking. It's historically strong power play. you can count on McDavid and Draisaitl on these guys producing. I mean, Zach Hyman's had another great playoffs for them. But it's all about what's going in the other end. And Stuart Skinner has faced some tough questions, even lost the net for a game in the previous series, but they roll on. So it's I think it's going to be pretty compelling. And we're based in Canada. It's just been so long since a Canadian team won a Stanley Cup. It would be quite something if they found a way to keep playing on and get the job done. But it's not going to be easy.
And like the Stars, they had a slow start to the game, but there's no reason to be worried if you're a Stars fan or if you're on that team that you can't still eke out 4 wins in this series. Like they have enough firepower that if it just gets going, they could easily win this series. So it's going to be a close one. And in the Eastern Conference, we got Florida and New York. And for the first time all playoffs, the Rangers trail in a series. And right now, the odds-on favorite in the betting market for the Stanley Cup was the Florida Panthers coming into the conference finals. Are they still the team to beat? Like, do you see New York being able to take down the Panthers and them stopping them from going to a second straight Stanley Cup final?
They obviously can do it, but I sort of side with where those setting those lines are looking at it. I mean, I think that Florida, I talk about experience. I mean, they got pretty darn close to it last year. They just top to bottom, it's hard to find a hole in their lineup. And, I think that they're built to play the way the game is played at this time of year. They're a nasty group of individuals. And I say that with a measure of respect. It's not a shot at them by any stretch. But they play the game hard. You're going to experience it on the other side. It'd be very interesting to see Matt Rempe enter the series and what that might do. I realize some of that becomes sideshow. You're not talking about a player who's going to play 20 minutes in the game, but that is an element of how you handle that from Florida is part of what has to go on. I mean, we saw it in the Bruins series with all the stuff with Brad Marchand. I mean, you have to choose. Do you try to leave them alone physically? Do you want to go back at them and show that you won't be pushed around? I think that there's there is a higher level question about how you want to approach that if you're a team going up against Florida. And really, I think they're good at setting the tone. And so to me, not just because of the one game and the 3-0 win and all that, I think Florida, is likely to come through this round because of the roster, their experience, and just the way they play. But the Rangers haven't really been tested in the playoffs just by virtue of sweeping the first round. They got ahead of Carolina. I know that the Hurricanes came back and made that series interesting, got it to a game 6, but they haven't faced something like this, not just a series deficit, but I think an animal quite like the way that the Panthers play. And so, game 2 is going to be massive with it being on home ice, especially. You never want to go down 0-2 in a series, but when you start the series at home, it's very tough to think about winning 4 out of 5 when you've only got potentially 2 games left. And it seems
like with every passing playoff series he plays in, and he might have been a Hall of Famer before last year and this year, but Sergei Bobrovsky, he's had one weird career where he's been benched a whole bunch of times. He's had his job lost, but then when push comes to shove in the playoffs, he always shows up in these big moments, and he's been unreal and worth every penny. Like, do you see him entering the Hall of Fame, and what kind of weird career has he had?
It certainly hasn't been a straight line, right? And he's 35 too, I believe. So he's to be performing at this level. I mean, it's fantastic for him, and makes that big deal that the Panthers signed not look quite so bad. Of course, that he's played at this level, especially these last 2 years. And I do think he's a Hall of Famer. It's always a hard call with goaltenders. I mean, we don't see a lot of goalies get in the Hall of Fame. There were a few exceptions last year. Tom Barrasso and Henrik Lundqvist both got in, and Mike Vernon, I believe, actually it was a three goalie class, but that's not the norm. And even the fact that so much time passed before Barrasso and Vernon got in tells you something. I mean, there's a lot of debate there. The only thing really missing from Bobrovsky's resume, I suppose, is a Stanley Cup. Maybe an Olympic gold medal, but with where we're at geopolitically in the world, I don't think any Russian player in any time in the near future is going to get a chance to add to their international legacy, because I just don't see Russia being allowed back in these sort of tournaments. But with 2 Vezinas already on his resume, each year he's climbing higher and higher on the wins list and games played list. I think winning those individual awards tends to tip you over the top because it says, at least for 2 seasons, you were the absolute best performer at your position. I mean, how do you define Hall of Fame? It's someone who was at the top of their craft for a window of time, a period of time. You are the best of the players in the world playing the sport. And so for sure, if he can get through and win a Stanley Cup, I don't even think there's a debate. I mean, if they win a Stanley Cup, he's probably going to get strong consideration for the Conn Smythe Trophy. I mean, if you win those types of awards after the career he's had or towards the end of a career he's had, I think that secures it. But for me, I think he's already there because I don't see him slowing down either. I mean, this team could win this year. It might not, but I don't think, I don't see the Panthers taking a big step back next year. And so, he's always been known for his work ethic. So through all the things you mentioned, the one thing that set Bobrovsky apart from a lot of players is just how fanatical he is about his time on the ice. I mean, he's one of the rare goalies, when you see the reporters tweeting, this guy's going to start, it's usually based on which goalie leaves the ice first of the morning skate. He's one of the goalies that will start a game, but stay on later than his partner because he's doing extra work. So, I think it tells you something about how he's been able to persevere. Obviously it's strength of mind, but I think his preparation level has always been at a Hall of Fame level, and he's getting rewarded with some results here the last couple seasons.
And to wrap our Friday edition of the CJ Show, do you have a stick tap to give out?
Ooh, I'm in an international frame of mind, and so I'm actually going to give my stick tap to David Pastrnak because I really respect the heck out of the fact that he lost in the second round of the playoffs, but with the World Championship being at home in Prague, basically him and Pavel Zacha got on a plane 2 days, I think, after the Bruins season officially ended, jumped right into a game, as did actually Martin Necas from Carolina for the Czechs. But, it does show how much that tournament means. Being on the ground, like David Pastrnak, I have to say, is a rock star in Czechia, like more than you might realize. Like I got all these pictures on my phone, but there are just massive billboards of him all over Prague. Even when you go down the escalator into the metro station, it's just David Pastrnak pictures. He represents a couple different brands, I think, in ads over there. And so I just thought it was cool after, obviously it being a tough season for Boston. I don't think he's 100% healthy either, but that he came over and he helped them get through the quarterfinal, which is the toughest game. And now, he's going to help give his country a chance to win a medal at home ice. So tip of the cap for finding a way to put aside whatever disappointment and give what he has left to his
I will
country.
give a stick tap to producer Drew, who has to fill in today for producer Nick and has to edit this show. So thank you, Drew, for doing that. That is all for us today. Thank you for letting me fill in on the CJ Show. It's been great. CJ, have a great weekend.
That was fun, man. And honestly, there'll be no backhanded compliments for you. You were first class. Julian's probably hearing footsteps now when he sees how well you did today.
No. Julian, your job is very safe.
I'm just kidding. Love you, Julian. We'll see you next week, pal.
Inside the Game, twice a week. Follow Chris on Twitter @ReporterChris. And follow Julian McKenzie @JK McKenzie.
The Chris Johnston Show.